Hello and welcome to the Genealogy Corner. Today we'll be exploring Spanish death certificates and how they have evolved since Spain introduced civil registration almost 150 years ago. If you have any questions, feel free to leave a comment or tweet your questions at DSR Genealogist, always using the Spanish Ancestry handle. The Spanish civil registration system, as we know it today, was created in 1870. And it came into force on the 1st of January 1871. This means that all births, marriages and deaths which have taken place on Spanish soil ever since are, or should be, recorded in the corresponding civil registry office, and I'll come back to that later. The Spanish civil registry is divided into four main sections: births, marriages, deaths, and guardianships and legal representations. Today we'll be talking specifically about deaths. Spain does not have one single registry office which centralizes all births, marriages, and deaths at national level. Instead, it has over 430 registry offices which usually operate at a municipal level, and over 7,600 magistrates' courts which also operate as registry offices, as do over 170 Spanish consulates around the world. This is an important detail to bear in mind, as deaths are generally registered in the place where the person died. If the place where the death occurred is not known, then the death will be registered in the place where the body was found. If the person died while traveling abroad, then the death will be registered in the place where the burial is to take place, or the first place of arrival, for example, if someone dies on a ship or a plane. If the deceased's family requests it, however, the death may be registered in the place where the person resided, provided the death occurred in Spain and not abroad. Access to the Spanish civil registry is generally unrestricted, except for very specific cases, and all certificates are issued free of charge, which is of course very good news for genealogists. The civil registry is therefore public for anyone who has an interest in knowledge of the entries, although there are exceptions to public access in order to protect the personal or family privacy of those concerned. To apply for a death certificate, one can make the request in person, by postal mail, or online via the website of the Spanish Ministry of Justice. I strongly advise against using non-official websites which charge a fee for ordering certificates. Now we have an overall idea about the civil registry in Spain, let's turn to death certificates and the information they contain. Over the years, the amount of information death certificates contain has varied considerably, a fact which researchers should take into consideration if looking for additional data for their genealogical research. To exemplify the differences between death certificates at various periods since its creation in 1871, I have taken 5 examples dating from 1872, 1873, 1914, 1967, and 2005. This death certificate dates back to 1872, when civil registration in Spain was in its infancy. As you can see, it is written by hand. It refers to a female relative of mine whose name, which I've highlighted, appears at the top of the document. Her age is given immediately below, and in addition to her address, her profession, and the date on which she died, we can also glean the cause of death, which I have also highlighted. The certificate features the name of both parents and where they came from respectively. The certificate also states that she was married and gives her husband's name and profession. Not only that, but the certificate mentions where her husband lived at the time, he was in the Navy and was obviously posted in another city, and the children's names and ages. Very helpfully, the certificate also mentions where the deceased will be buried, which is a helpful clue if we want to search for a burial record. The following death certificate dates only from a year later, 1873, and the differences with the previous example are striking. This death certificate was issued using a pre-filled form. These printed forms would become the norm in most civil registry offices as of 1903 or 1904, although many smaller towns continued to use written forms as late as the early 1920s. As this 1914 death certificate shows, death certificates often include a reference to the notary who drew up the deceased's last will and testament. This clue is of vital importance if you're researching your ancestor's will, which we'll talk about on another occasion. Moving on a few decades, we come to the 1960s. Some certificates, such as this one from 1967, do not feature the deceased's age. Instead, they include the exact date of birth and the city of birth, a great clue if we want to track the person's birth certificate. Content-wise, certificates as recently as the 1990s remained largely unaltered. Perhaps the most significant change to death certificates came in 1994, when changing legislation in Spain decreed that the cause of death would be blanked out or crossed out from any death certificate issued as of 6th of June of that year. This measure, which was not implemented immediately by every civil registry office, was taken to protect the intimacy of the deceased. It was, of course, a controversial measure, and to the best of my knowledge, Spain is the only country in the world where death certificates do not actually include a cause of death. Fortunately for us genealogists, registry offices don't always cross out the cause of death in pre-1994 certificates, so we may still learn about cause of death even if we're not supposed to. And so we move on to the last example, dated 2005, by when all certificates were filled in digitally. As you can see, very little personal information is displayed, with only the person's name, birth details, parentage, address, and death details being recorded. No cause of death is listed, but details of the doctor who certified the death are included, and by following up those details, it is in fact possible to retrieve medical records and find out the person's cause of death. Accessing these papers, however, is usually restricted to the immediate family, so they are unlikely to become an accessible resource for genealogists. Well, that's all we have time for today. Remember that if you have any questions, you can leave a comment below or address your questions on Twitter to DSR Genealogist using the handle Spanish Ancestry. Thanks for watching, thanks for listening, and happy researching.